In the early 19th century, London was a dangerous place to live.
From this crowded metropolis came some of the most notorious and intriguing murder cases.
In the years of the early 19th century, there was a lot of concern about crime, including Spencer Percival being assassinated. People generally were not safe from highway robbers, whether they were the Prime Minister or anybody else.
Many of these killings captured the public's imagination and inspired the country's greatest writers and artists. These murders also contributed to a significant change in policing. The law had traditionally been enforced by parish constables or watchmen.
People didn't want to be an unpaid policeman, which is what the constables and watchmen were.
They'd call out the time, they'd look out for fires, and they were meant to keep law and order.
The formation of the Metropolitan Police would establish the modern force which is still active today. But it wasn't just the threat of murder or violence that frightened the people. Disease was everywhere.
A cholera epidemic had raged across London in the summer of 1849. Over 14,000 people were killed.
The big problem here was the Thames by this time was an open sewer. It was said it took 30 tides to float a dead dog out of London. Londoners put all their sewage into the Thames. The tide went out, the sewage came back. The Thames was also their drinking water.
The residents of Bermondsey in southeast London had to suffer the tides of sewage that collected on the banks of the Thames.
The leather trade dominated the local economy, and the stink of its tanneries hung over the closely packed houses.
For tanning, you needed lots of urine. And so you had urine being collected and put in great vats for the tanning process. So this didn't actually sort of help the odours of Bermondsey.
But for one man, it wasn't disease that was lurking for him in the homes and streets of London. Murder was afoot, and like so many murders, this one was to begin with a torrid affair. Marie de Roux was born in Lausanne, Switzerland. She moved to England and acquired a taste for the higher things in life when she went into service as femme de chambre to Lady Evelyn Blantyre. Her employment was at one of the grandest homes in London, Stafford House.
Their things were marble and silver, and the dinners they had, the dances, incroyable. I had dresses for the opera, for travel. We were in France many, many times. I never imagined I would see things such as this. That was before I was married.
Get dinner on.
In spite of his suspected criminal background, they were wed at St. James Church, Piccadilly, in 1847. It's thought that Fred managed to seduce Marie by saying that he was going to inherit a great deal of property from his mother. The deception was to prove a critical part of this marriage. Marie had had a relationship with Patrick O'Connor before she was married, and they remained close.
Patrick O'Connor was a 50-year-old, quite wealthy man who took a shine to Maria de Roux.
I have to get back to the office.
The relationship between the three seems to have been a sort of a casual ménage à trois. O'Connor obviously did have money, and this, I think, well, almost certainly this was the attraction for Mrs. Manning.
This tryst was soon to prove deadly.
It was Mr. Walsh who persuaded him to pay.
Well, I know the man a little.
It is so fortunate you join us then, to celebrate. So unexpected.
Patrick O'Connor was supposed to turn up at the Mannings' household alone, but he was unable to shake off his friend, Pierce Walsh.
Patrick O'Connor still had affection for Maria and would visit. Quite what those visits consisted of, we shall never know.
He thought if he left it long enough I'd forget. But I've every shilling in my book and every penny of interest. Sorry, Fred. All this money talk must be boring you. I'll take a glass while you're there. They say it helps keep off the cholera.
Then my husband will be the last to get it.
A proper man's drink.
Your health?
Mr. O'Connor.
I'm fine.
It's the pipe smoke, probably.
Maybe a glass of water, will that help?
Mr. Walsh, can you help my husband? I think that we all need water.
As long as he doesn't choke on that too.
Where were you?
How does he drink so much of that?
4 hours I have been sitting here waiting.
Maria.
No. I said 6.
I couldn't get rid of him.
Everything was ready.
I know. I'm sorry.
I said 6.
I'll come tomorrow. I promise.
Only you?
Just me.
Promise. Tell no one. I think that most men do not have the courage. Or if they have the courage, they do not have the intelligence.
On the 8th of August, 1849, things had not gone to plan. But the following night, things would be very different.
A shocking murder was about to take place that would fascinate press and public alike. A desperate manhunt would be conducted on both land and sea to capture the culprits.
The notorious tale of the Bermondsey Horror was about to unfold.
I was still a lady's maid when I met Patrick. He said my accent reminded him of Madame Celeste. Yes? The actress. I do not know. He was tall. That was before I met Frederick.
Patrick O'Connor came from County Tipperary in Ireland. He'd found his way to London in order to make his fortune, and it's thought that he first met Marie when she was on a trip to Europe with her mistress. It's understood he was very annoyed that she accepted Frederick's proposal before he had a chance to make his own. Rather oddly, the three of them remained in contact after the marriage. On the 8th of August, 1849, Marie Manning had lain in wait in the home she shared with her alcoholic husband, Frederick. But the plan had been thwarted by the unexpected arrival of Pierce Walsh. The very next night, Patrick O'Connor, with whom Marie Manning was still having an affair, made his way to the house alone.
Eat first.
From the office. All right, I'll wash him. Where is the devil then? Emptying his pockets on cheap brandy. Marie?
What became known as the Bermondsey Horror was actually the murder of Patrick O'Connor.
He was brutally bludgeoned, presumably by Frederick Manning. I mean, he was hit something like 17 times.
Patrick O'Connor met a grisly end. The Mannings buried him under the flagstone floor of their kitchen at number 3 Miniver Place, and he would remain there. It would be a while before anyone was aware of the death of Patrick O'Connor. In the meantime, Marie and Frederick Manning had to set their plans in motion. They had a lot to do if they were to profit from this murder.
I went to his lodgings. His landlady, she doesn't like me there. But if Mr. O'Connor wants it, what can she do? me, Frederick, and his shares of the railway.
The Mannings had what they wanted. Railway shares, much like these. Patrick O'Connor was a very wealthy man, having done exceedingly well as a moneylender. But the Mannings needed to act soon because people would inevitably notice the disappearance of a well-known figure like Patrick O'Connor.
And what is it you say to them?
That I've got some shares I'm wanting to sell.
What shares? Eastern?
Eastern Counties Consolidated Stock. 20 shares. £120.
Bon. And what is your name?
Patrick O'Connor.
Patrick O'Connor went missing on an evening when he'd been invited to dine at the Mannings. And when he didn't turn up for work, people got concerned, started to make inquiries.
All this activity and Patrick O'Connor's disappearance obviously caught a few people's attention. In a time of rampant cholera, sudden death was commonplace, but sudden disappearance means people will start looking for you.
I saw Mr. O'Connor leave with you, but since...
So he didn't come for dinner on Thursday?
No.
Just I spoke to some of his colleagues down at the docks, and O'Connor told them he was on his way here. They saw him on London Bridge. He said he was on his way. He didn't come.
No, but we invited him, yes, for dinner, but he did not...
Nobody's seen him since.
It would only be a matter of time before the Mannings fell under suspicion. But in the meantime, it would require quite an effort on the part of the new London police force to unravel the mystery of what happened at number 3 Minerva Place, Bermondsey, and even more, to track down the perpetrators and bring them to justice. It would become known as the Bermondsey Horror. Marie and Frederick Manning had murdered Patrick O'Connor and buried him under the flagstones of their kitchen. Marie had stolen O'Connor's railway shares and intended to cash in on their devious plan. But Pierce Walsh and others were still looking for O'Connor. The Mannings were running out of time. They were also suspicious of each other and on the verge of an ill-timed marital breakup.
Furniture dealer?
Yes!
But I'm only just back.
Say to him we sell everything.
Everything?
Patrick, he told people he was coming here. They will come. They will find him. One dress. That was all I kept from my work for Lady Blantyre. I never wore it. When was I able to wear it with Frederick? I was taking what I was promised.
Marie? I spoke with Bainbridge. 15 shillings deposit. The rest when he comes round tomorrow. Marie?
Marie Manning was gone. Frederick Manning would soon be gone too. They were both now on their own. And the police would have to use all their ingenuity, as well as the latest technology, to track them down and bring them to justice.
The Metropolitan Police was only 20 years old at this point. There'd been a real need to create it in dangerous early 19th century London.
Well, before 1829, when the Metropolitan Police first started patrolling the streets of London, the system was organised by local parishes.
People didn't want to be an unpaid policeman. So what was approved was the hiring of substitutes. Now, the easiest substitutes to be hired were the old age pensioners.
Some of them were infirm and decrepit and couldn't really do the job that was required for controlling crime in London of those years.
So this led to a growing dependence upon the rope as a solution to crime. In the reign of Henry VIII, the death penalty is in for about 25 offences. By the time Dickens is a boy, it's in for over 200. You could be hanged for murder, you could be hanged for writing on Westminster Bridge. You could be hanged for stealing, you could be hanged for impersonating a pensioner. Age was no limit. As late as 1830, a boy of 9 was sentenced to be hanged for setting fire to a house.
London had been rocked by the Ratcliffe Highway murders, in which 2 families were attacked, leaving 7 people dead.
They arrested John Williams, who actually committed suicide in prison, and then the Home Secretary ordered that his dead body should be displayed on a cart, and there was this great procession that went through Wapping, and then they buried this John Williams with a stake through his heart.
The city suffered terrible crimes, but remained without an adequate law enforcement agency.
This problem was addressed by Robert Peel, Home Secretary. In 1829, he brought in the Metropolitan Police Act, which created the world's first modern police force.
Of course, once it had gone through, all hell broke loose because people did not want a police force. And so when the first policemen went out on the streets at the end of 1829, they were stoned, they were held down in the road while coaches and horses were driven over them, they were beaten up. There were cases of men being blinded.
Even though it was only 2 decades old by the time of the Mannings murder, the force had already dealt with several high-profile murder cases.
Thomas Griffiths Wainwright, a case that was to prove a challenge for the new London police force. He was one of the city's earliest known serial murderers.
Thomas Wainwright ended up taking up life assurance policies and then poisoning his wife, his sister-in-law, and so on.
The evidence against him could only be proved against one of the victims, and he, instead of going to the gallows, as was confidently expected, he went to, he was transported to Australia, and he died there some years later.
His life story was to prove intriguing to some of the nation's greatest writers. Oscar Wilde was inspired to write pen, pencil, and poison after hearing his story, and we think it's Wainwright who was referenced by Arthur Conan Doyle in his Sherlock Holmes case, The Adventure of the Illustrious Client. Another high-profile case, Lord William Russell, the long-time Member of Parliament, had been murdered in his sleep by having his throat slashed.
Courvoisier had only been employed by him as a valet for about 5 weeks, and during that time he'd already stolen some silver plate which he'd deposited with a friend. But Courvoisier thought he was going to be dismissed, and it's at this point he goes to the kitchen, takes a knife and cuts Russell's throat.
The police were able to deduce that a robbery had been faked.
There was no trace of any external burglary or breaking of any sort. It was actually that thorough search of the crime scene that provided the evidence that led to Courvoisier's arrest.
Courvoisier was hanged outside Newgate Prison in front of a crowd of 40,000 people. Charles Dickens was one of them, as was William Makepeace Thackeray, and they were both appalled by what they saw.
Thackeray even wrote an essay entitled On Going to See a Man Hanged. In it he said, "I feel myself ashamed and degraded at the brutal curiosity that took me to that spot." Charles Dickens would soon have another murder case grab his attention as the police were closing in on the mysterious disappearance of Patrick O'Connor in the summer of 1849.
Thanks to the suspicions of his friends, such as Pierce Walsh, the authorities were now actively searching for Mr. O'Connor, and his last known location was 3 Miniver Place, Bermondsey.
The kitchen floor was very neat. It had just been freshly whitened. 2 police officers who had the key from the landlord noticed that a couple of the flagstones had damp edges. So he put his penknife there and it was soft. So they heaved up the flagstones, dug down deeper, and then they found a toe. They realised that they probably found Patrick O'Connor.
Patrick O'Connor had been buried face down, naked, with his feet tied back to his thighs. His body was covered in quicklime.
Stupidly, when they were after they put quicklime on the body to destroy it, they left his false teeth in, which led to his identification by the dentist.
Actually, that was a sort of milestone, if you like, in identification.
This was now a murder investigation, and the hunt for the killers was on. A £100 reward had been issued by the Home Secretary, Sir George Grey, for the apprehension of the suspects. But it was police ingenuity that led to the capture of Marie Manning rather than a mob in search of a big payday.
Scotland Yard were brought in and the new detective branch started inquiries. There'd been some luggage with a lady answering Manning's description that had gone up to Edinburgh.
Mrs. Smith,
Yes?
there's 2 gentlemen here to see you.
They used the new telegraph system to contact the Edinburgh police, traced Manning, brought her back to London.
It was the telegraph also that led to the capture of Frederick Manning, when a report came in on the wire that he'd been spotted on a steamer heading for the Channel Islands. It turned out he spent most of his time there in hiding.
Police! Get down on the floor, Patrick! Get down on the floor! Frederick Manning, you are under arrest for the murder of Patrick O'Connor!
The morbid tale of the Mannings electrified the public. It was dubbed the Bermondsey Horror. The Times even reported that she was reading their report of the crime when the messenger of justice interrupted her studies.
The Mannings had nowhere to hide. They didn't even have each other anymore, given how their relationship had soured. In their trial at the Old Bailey, they would mount their own separate defences, and Marie would become furious
No!
with the way she was treated.
I will not stand it!
But it's hard to argue against a dead body being found under your kitchen floor. On the 9th of August, 1849, Patrick O'Connor, an Irishman, had been murdered at 3 Miniver Place in Bermondsey. His sudden disappearance had not gone unnoticed, and a week later, the police discovered his body buried under the kitchen floor. A nationwide hunt was launched for his killers, who had fled in opposite directions. Marie Manning was attempting to start a new life in Edinburgh, Scotland, while Frederick Manning was in hiding on the Isle of Jersey. Both were swiftly captured and locked up in Newgate Prison, facing the charge of murder.
The Mannings' trial at the Old Bailey was the talk of the town. It seemed everyone had an opinion about the Bermondsey horror. Frederick Manning's defense was simple. He wanted to exploit the intense negative press surrounding Marie Manning to his own advantage and blame the whole thing on her. She was, after all, the foreigner in the midst.
My hypothesis might, at first sight, appear shocking and unmanly. We're all in the habit of associating the female character with mildness and obedience, and the male character with power and strength. This rule is not a universal one, however. History teaches us that the female is capable of reaching higher in point of virtue than the male. But when she descends to vice, she sinks far lower than our sex. My hypothesis, then, is that the female defendant, Manning, premeditated, planned, and concocted the murder, and made her husband her dupe and instrument for that purpose.
Marie's defense, on the other hand, suggested that she hadn't been at the scene of the crime at all and only became involved in the cover-up and the theft.
I don't think there was any particular reason to think that they weren't acting in concert together, and they both escaped together, even though they escaped in different directions.
I can't believe that he would have had the courage to do it on his own. I think I think she was the driving force there.
Marie refused to look at her husband during the trial and testified that O'Connor was more to me than my husband, and that he'd been killed by Fred in a jealous rage. But it was Marie who invited the victim to dinner, and it was she who'd taken delivery of a new shovel on the very day of the murder. Could it have been fear for her own life in the face of a violent, jealous, dangerous man that made her steal the victim's money? Could it be that same fear that made her flee to Scotland?
I think it was almost inevitable that they would be found guilty. I mean, they had the railway shares, the body was found under the flags in their kitchen.
In those days, trials at the Old Bailey were very short. They took place very, very quickly. Certainly in the 18th century, the average Old Bailey trial lasted about 10 minutes. A jury would be sworn in for the day and would deal with several cases. So, looking back, the criminal justice system seems a bit rough and ready by today's standards. But by the standards of the day, they would have been regarded as fairly convicted, I'm sure.
The jury took just 45 minutes to reach their verdict.
Frederick George Manning and Maria Manning, you have been convicted of the crime of murder.
No! I will not stand it! You are to be ashamed of yourselves. There is no law, no justice here.
You have been defended by able counsel.
They called no witness.
Every topic that their ingenuity and experience taught them has been urged in your defense. You have been found guilty upon evidence that clearly leaves no room for rational doubt in the mind of any human being who has heard the evidence. There is but one sentence open to me consistent with justice: that you be taken hence to Her Majesty's jail in the county of Surrey, and thence to the place of execution, severally to be hung by the neck until you be dead. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul.
Behold, thou desirest truth in the inward parts, and in this hidden part thou shalt make me to know wisdom. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow.
For the penny press and the public, this was to be one of the greatest crime sensations of the century. It had all the ingredients necessary to satisfy a prurient public. Sexual intrigue, a vicious murder, a pretty foreign villainess, a desperate manhunt. It fed the nation's insatiable desire for gruesome stories. The Mannings were hanged on the roof of Horsemonger Lane Jail before a crowd that some people said was 50,000 strong. Charles Dickens watched the execution from the window of a rented room in a nearby house.
He attended the public execution of the Mannings by Horsemonger Lane Jail and felt very disturbed by the way that the crowd reacted.
He was a famous author by this time, and he decided to use his fame to highlight the barbarity on show by writing a letter to the Times.
Sir, I was a witness of the execution at Horsemonger Lane this morning. I believe that a sight so inconceivably awful as the wickedness and levity of the immense crowd collected at that execution this morning could be imagined by no man. The horrors of the gibbet and of the crime which brought the wretched murderers to it faded in my mind before the atrocious bearing, looks, and language of the assembled spectators. I do not believe that any community can prosper where such a scene of horror and demoralization as was enacted this morning outside Horsemonger Lane Jail is presented at the very doors of good citizens and is passed by unknown or forgotten.
Public executions were part of London life and drew enormous crowds, particularly for controversial murders.
Dickens is critical of the Mannings execution, but he's not against hanging, he's against public hangings.
Charles Dickens may have been rightly appalled by the spectacle of the Mannings execution, but he was inspired to write one of his greatest novels, Bleak House. The character of Hortense, maid to Lady Dedlock, whose tumultuous past drives much of the story, was based on Marie Manning. So, that was the tale of the Bermondsey Horror, one of the most notorious murder cases of the 19th century. It wasn't only Charles Dickens who got caught up in the shocking story. The case continued to be discussed for many decades after the Mannings' execution. In fact, it was widely believed that the black satin dress that Marie Manning wore for her public hanging led to the sudden unpopularity of that fabric and a new epithet for Marie, the woman who murdered black satin. Like so many stories associated with notorious murders, I think that one's a bit of an urban myth. But what is true is that this case enraptured the nation. The Bermondsey Horror became a key tale in the story of London's dark side.
In the late Victorian era, Jack the Ripper dominated the headlines. Whoever he was, he terrorized the Whitechapel area of London's East End.
Conditions in Whitechapel and East London were sort of pretty horrendous in the heart of what became the Spitalfields area. Tremendous density of population.
People lived very closely together in those days. Streets were very crowded, very narrow, very dark. A lot of poverty.
Outside London, the population was about 25 persons an acre. In London, outside the East End, about 50 persons an acre. In the East End, in the heart of it, in Spitalfields, it was over 800 persons an acre. So you had this tremendous overcrowding.
A lot of people weren't able to survive except barely on the breadline.
Also, there are businesses pushing into the area and buildings are being demolished, so housing is getting less and less, and so you have 7, 8, 9 persons in a room. It is pretty horrendous.
Whitechapel itself was considered to be the very worst slum in London. The author Jack London, in his first-hand account of the impoverished area, The People of the Abyss, wrote, "Nowhere in the streets of London may one escape the sight of abject poverty, while 5 minutes' walk from almost any point will bring one to a slum. But the region my hansom was now penetrating was one unending slum."
It was in this foul environment that the Whitechapel murders would begin in 1888. The notorious crimes of Jack the Ripper horrified the city and, indeed, the entire world. But he wasn't the only killer around. Late Victorian London had some of the most unpleasant characters in the capital's history. Could one of these known killers also have been Jack the Ripper? There was the Ogress of Reading, Amelia Dyer, the Lambeth poisoner, Dr. Cream, and the mysterious George Chapman, who carried out a terrible crime on Borough High Street.
The area around Borough High Street was notorious in the 19th century. The street had been the only route into London from the south, leading, as it did, straight up to London Bridge. In 1874, a police constable was to make a horrifying discovery outside number 54 Borough High Street when he apprehended Henry Wainwright, clutching the dismembered and decomposing body of his young mistress Harriet Lane wrapped in a cloth. Harriet Lane was to become Navy slang for preserved meat.
A great many alehouses and coaching inns lined the road. One of the most infamous was the Crown, whose proprietor in the year 1901 was Mr. George Chapman. That wasn't his original name, though. He was born Severin Antonovich Klosowski in Poland in 1865.
Chapman had originally trained in Poland as a felcher. Felcher is often mistranslated in the Chapman story as surgeon, but felchers were not surgeons. They were military barbers who'd had some training as medical orderlies. And they were clearly held in low esteem by the Polish military establishment, which is maybe why, after years of training, Chapman decided to move to London. You'd be forgiven for being a bit suspicious about Mr. Klosowski, aka Chapman, when I tell you that his dilapidated pub, the Monument Tavern, was destroyed by fire, and he made a substantial insurance claim. It was refused, but that didn't stop him moving on, with a new pub and a new wife, Maud Marsh.
Right by here?
Yep, we're selling seats upstairs. For 20 shillings, you can wave at the king. You never know, he might just wave back.
He'd certainly wave at you, from what I've heard.
I've never listened to those rumours. Louisa, when you're done with that, can you make a start on dinner?
Yes, Mrs. Chapman.
He employed several young women, and in August 1901, a certain Maud Marsh was looking for work. Maud and her mother arrived for an interview with Chapman, and she was immediately employed.
Seems strange, though. A king.
I know. As far as I'm concerned, a woman should always be in charge. I was just telling this gentleman here about the parade.
Check the vitals.
Of course.
Get out.
My daughter started working with him that summer. Late August, it would have been. He was pushy with her at first, I felt. They were married very quickly. But she did seem happy.
Watch all the neighbours cry. There you go, meat bill. Have you bought the street bill? Love, love, love. George? Louisa?
Maud Marsh was not married for long before she fell violently ill.
Maud started to suffer a lot of vomiting, and she spent 12 days in Guy's hospital and actually sort of recovered, then went back home again and then started to suffer again.
Maud Marsh had been struck down by mystery illness. Her mother and her doctor would be unable to determine the cause. One man knew, however, George Chapman. He would have complete control over the dreadful scenario that played out above the Crown pub. But just how long would his crime remain undetected? Maud Marsh, a young woman of 19, had not long been in the employ of George Chapman, the proprietor of the Crown Pub on Borough High Street. They soon became husband and wife, and not long after, Maud was taken ill. Chapman was the only person to know the cause of her sickness.
Murderers like George Chapman were tricky to catch because poison was hard to detect at this time. In fact, so much so that arsenic had earned the nickname inheritance powder. Such was the problem. But the poison that George Chapman was using was something different, tartar emetic, which contained the equally deadly element antimony. 4 years before Maud was taken mysteriously ill, Chapman had bought an ounce of tartar emetic from a chemist in Hastings.
Tartar emetic was used for cough mixtures. It caused irritation of the throat, but it also caused vomiting. Antimony was a metal which was part of the mixture. Too much would cause the victim's death.
An ounce is about 450 grains. 12 grains would be enough for a fatal dose.
Poison was very easy. One could go to a shop, buy a poison. You say you wanted it for the rats. Poison was used in all sorts of wallpaper, fly paper. So poison was very, very easily available.
An ounce would be enough to kill more than 40 people. It was certainly enough to kill Mary Spink and Bessie Taylor.
They were Chapman's previous wives, both of whom died from a mysterious illness just a couple of years after meeting him. Chapman had actually brought in a doctor to treat Bessie Taylor when she fell ill, but the doctor was unable to discover that the real cause of her illness was Chapman himself. In fact, the doctor was convinced that Chapman was in a genuine state of grief. When Maud Marsh fell ill, the same Dr. Stoker would be brought in.
Before in the summer, it was the same. She was on hospital. Doctors there have no clue. They say me, is this.
But she did recover?
Yes.
Well then, you have my instructions.
You come tomorrow?
Yes, of course. Do not concern yourself too much, Mr. Chapman. She is young, and she is strong, and she has you to look after her. I'm not worried. I can see him now, broken with distress, urging me to spare no trouble, no expense. I was there most days. I had no conception of what he was really doing.
What?
You haven't finished your water. There's a good girl. She's doing much better already.
Is that champagne?
It's for stomach.
George, come on, don't waste the champagne.
Why is these customers drinking it? When you're like this? No. Are you needing more water? I will fetch. Drink.
Told you about him.
You'll be right as rain. I know it.
George Chapman had a very clear and despicable modus operandi. He seemingly enjoyed watching the suffering of a slow death by poisoning. A local chap walked into the Crown pub when he was a boy and was served a glass of water by the owner. That boy was to become the world-famous Charlie Chaplin, and he wrote about the incident in his autobiography in 1964. As a boy, I stopped at a saloon in London Bridge Road and asked for a glass of water. A bluff, amiable gentleman with a dark moustache served me. For some reason, I could not drink the water. I pretended to, but as soon as the man turned to talk to a customer, I put the glass down and left. 2 weeks later, George Chapman, proprietor of the Crown Public House in the London Bridge Road, was charged with murdering 5 wives by poisoning them with strychnine. His latest victim was dying in a room above the saloon the day he gave me the glass of water. Well, Charlie Chaplin clearly got a few details wrong there, but what he was right about is that while he was standing in that pub, Maud Marsh was dying in the room above his head.
She couldn't keep anything down. I had all her favourites made. Roast pork and potatoes and... You're supposed to make everything right for your child.
For many years, George Chapman seemed untouchable. His devious work as a poisoner had gone undetected. Now, another victim, Maud Marsh, was bedridden and close to death. How much more harm and misery would he inflict before he would be eventually brought to justice? In the down-at-heel area of Borough High Street during the reign of Jack the Ripper, a poisoner was also at work. George Chapman had already killed 2 wives and was now working towards the murder of another, Maud Marsh. Thankfully, it would only be a matter of time before suspicions finally started to form around him.
Mrs. Marsh?
You did this?
What?
Maud said you liked photography.
Yes, I make photographs here. I mix chemicals. Keep it.
It's the not even knowing, George. Can't we get a second opinion?
Dr. Stoker, he is a very good man.
Yes.
And I think if one doctor cannot help, even 50 will not.
George, we have to try.
Chapman couldn't evade suspicion for much longer. Maud's mother, although still unaware of what he was doing, was growing more and more wary. But the fact that his hobby was photography seemed to allay her misgivings. This new technology would also be used by the Metropolitan Police at the time.
Chapman was an amateur photographer, which would have been quite unusual for those days. The police had started using photography. They used sort of professional photographers for things like identifying bodies that had been found. It did start to become more and more used by the police, particularly on scenes of crime, and particularly in sort of identifying criminals. They photographed some of the victims in the Whitechapel murders, so we're talking about 1889, that sort of period.
It was an especially dangerous time for prostitutes in London. Jack the Ripper is believed by most experts to have murdered 5 women in his killing spree. But others were at work too, one of the worst being Dr. Thomas Neil Cream.
He was the cross-eyed, silk-hatted poisoner in South London. He was living in the Lambeth area, and this is when he started giving prostitutes pills containing strychnine.
Supposedly to avoid them being pregnant, or perhaps to procure an abortion, but actually the pills themselves were poisoned, and a number of prostitutes actually sort of died on the streets, and they were only 19 or 20 years old.
He could never stop talking, giving information away. So when there is obviously a hunt for the Lambeth poisoner, he actually names a victim who the police knew nothing at all about. And when eventually he is arrested, there's all these strychnine bottles found in his lodgings.
He was on the gallows, and the hangman said that just immediately before the trapdoor dropped and he was executed, he said, "I am Jack the..." and that was his last words.
Another criminal operating at exactly the same time as Jack the Ripper was Amelia Dyer, the Ogress of Reading. She was working in the grim trade of baby farming.
Baby farming came about because sort of in the 18th century, London was infamous for the number of babies who were just dumped on the street, put on dunghills and left to rot.
If women were left with a baby, they would pay for a woman to look after them. But sometimes these women neglected them, and in 2 or 3 cases, there were notorious cases, such as Amelia Dyer.
Amelia Dyer, she would advertise nurseries. Then, of course, what she did, she strangled them, wrapped them in a parcel and dumped them in the river. Eventually, she was caught. She'd been baby farming for about 15 years.
Amelia was said to have been the cause of the death of 400 infants. The sort of child's cruelty and neglect was of a completely different dimension to what we've become used to today.
The Ogress of Reading, as she was dubbed by the press at the time, even had a song written about her. The old baby farmer, the wretched Miss Dyer, at the Old Bailey her wages is paid. In times long ago, we'd have made a big fire and roasted so nicely that wicked old jade.
But while Amelia Dyer and Dr. Cream were captured and executed, George Chapman's crimes still remained undetected, and Maud Marsh was becoming very ill. Distressed at her daughter's declining health, Mrs. Marsh decided to seek the advice of her own family physician, Dr. Grapple.
Mr. Chapman. Dr. Francis Grapple.
Yes?
I was asked... This is the Crown.
Doctor! Thank you so much for coming. My daughter's just up here.
With her, Doctor! No, 50 will not.
Miss Marsh was in a semi-comatose state. Her skin was this dirty jaundice, and she writhed with pain whenever I touched her. She was very sick indeed.
I was alongside Dr. Grapple throughout his examination. He supported my course of action entirely. There really was no need to involve a second doctor.
Maud Marsh lay suffering in her bed. The doctors Stoker and Grapple were doing their best to treat her, and in the process, becoming suspicious that foul play might lie behind this sudden illness of a girl whom everyone described as vivacious and full of life.
A foreign irritant?
From something she ate, perhaps. A poison. Can you recall anything?
There was a rabbit. The girl bought it at the New Cut Market. I said... Was it that, do you suppose? Oh, I could throttle her.
Perhaps. However, you don't get arsenic in rabbits. Deliberate poisoning did cross my mind. But an accident still seemed more likely. To say otherwise, well, it's tantamount to accusing someone of murder.
The two doctors seemed to have been very, very professional. He said they'd been eating rabbit and he suspected ptomaine poisoning, but then when he went home he thought, no, this is wrong, the symptoms are all wrong, went back.
The two doctors then got together and said, it's just as though she's been suffering from some irritant poison.
Isn't he wonderful? I can see an improvement in her already.
She's very young. Better get up.
Oh, I'm sure you have things to do.
It's fine. Sit.
I need to feel useful, George. She'll pull through. I'm sure of it. Now that Dr. Grapple's here.
George.
What?
George. Oh, she was better.
What the?
I don't understand it. She was better.
Yeah. What the?
Drink, my darling.
Maud! Maud!
She died at noon.
Mr. Marsh informed me. I couldn't believe it. I thought he'd called me to tell me she was on the mend.
George Chapman had struck again. This would be his last act of terror. He'd put on his grieving widower routine for sure, but he wouldn't get away with it this time. Luck had run out for one of the capital's most wretched individuals.
Chapman would soon find himself questioned by the police, who were starting to piece together his deeply suspicious past. His terrifying life story would be laid bare for all to see at the Old Bailey.
Maud Marsh was dead, and George Chapman was putting on his well-worked grieving act. He had successfully faked breaking down in floods of tears moments after she died. Maud's mother would later describe him as being dreadfully upset.
With suspicion around him mounting, the doctors would not release a death certificate. Chapman's grieving routine may have worked on Dr. Stoker before, but this time it would count for nothing.
You come to the funeral? I think she would. You have death certificate?
I'm afraid there will have to be a post-mortem. I know it's not what anyone wants, but I cannot sign the certificate without establishing cause of death.
Exhaustion. She has been sick.
But what caused the sickness? Knowing will help.
I do not see the use in it.
Maud Marsh's symptoms caused the doctors not to give a certificate for her death, for her burial.
The doctor refused to issue a death certificate. There was then a post-mortem.
The initial autopsy may not have shown anything out of the ordinary, but what happened next was truly bizarre. The mortuary where the post-mortem was taking place was very close to the Crown pub. And as Dr. Stoker and his colleagues were working away, they were interrupted by an unwanted guest.
We were discussing the post-mortem results when the mortuary keeper thought he heard something outside. I didn't hear anything, but footsteps, he thought, in the garden. The public weren't allowed in at that hour, of course, so he went outside to check. As he opened the door, he saw a man disappearing into the gardens, running off. The mortuary is a few hundred yards from the Crown. It was Chapman. He had been listening to us at the door.
The unexplained nighttime visit only heightened Dr. Stoker's suspicions. The next morning, he took 2 jars with the contents of Maud's stomach and samples of her internal organs to the nearby Clinical Research Association. Their tests found an appreciable amount of antimony, and it was determined that this poison was the cause of her death. Stoker contacted the police.
She was so proud of this place.
Needs a little bit more.
The day when the new king, Edward VII, was due to celebrate his coronation, the 25th of October 1902, was approaching fast.
The local residents all had that day marked in their calendars, for there was to be a royal procession. When Detective Inspector Godley arrived, the pub was doing a roaring trade.
Poison. She was in a hospital with same sickness.
Well, we'd like you to come to the station while we make inquiries.
Today?
Now.
I know nothing about poison. I come. No handcuffs. But for business.
Just 2 old friends then. Going for a walk.
Chapman was finally in custody. He was not allowed to attend the funeral of Maud Marsh, but he did cover all of the expenses. Maud was buried on the 5th of November 1902 in what was a very grand affair. Chapman sent an elaborate wreath comprising many flowers, and he signed it rather curiously, from a devoted friend. He read all about the funeral in the national newspapers, but was still offering investigators very little help. They knew nothing about his life story, and the stories circulating in the press about him were all wrong, but he did nothing to correct them beyond repeatedly pleading his own innocence. While the hearings were continuing in coroners and police courts, investigators were still at work.
He didn't do much talking, but he left plenty of evidence for us at the pub. His books were all medical. His accounts included a most helpful record of purchasing tartar emetic in April 1897. And we found 2 memorial cards he presumably kept as trophies. One for Mrs. Mary Chapman, and another for Mrs. Bessie Chapman.
When the police were dealing with this unexplained death, they had the post-mortem, the doctors started to find these traces of poison in her stomach, and they knew that Chapman had had 2 other wives, and they therefore exhumed the bodies and examined them. Now, he was only charged with the 1 murder, but they actually brought in evidence about the 2 other women in whose bodies poison was also found, and this all led to the evidence being used to convict him.
Chapman's trial began on the 16th of May, 1903. The prosecution was led by Edward Carson.
If a distinction can be made in degrees of murder, I submit none is more determined and more malicious than that by poisoning. Certainly, no murder could be more demonstrative of the cruelty of the perpetrator than that of a man standing by the bedside of a person he professed to love, seeing her torture day after day from what he had by his own hand administered.
Edward Carson was a very famous lawyer,
prominent barrister in Britain.
He prosecuted Oscar Wilde and secured his conviction.
The fact that Chapman had purchased a large quantity of antimony-rich tartar emetic from a chemist several years before was very strong evidence against him.
The prosecution had a key witness in the victim's grieving mother.
I live at 14 Longfellow Road, Croydon, and am the wife of Robert Marsh.
And what is your relationship to the deceased?
Maud was my daughter.
How old was your daughter, Mrs. Marsh?
She would have been 20 on February 17th.
Can you tell me the nature of her first meeting with the prisoner?
She had been a barmaid in a situation at Croydon. In August 1901, she was out of that, so she advertised for a new one.
And what was the result of that advertisement?
She got an answer, and in consequence, I went with her to meet the prisoner. He called himself Chapman.
And what happened?
We had a talk about Maud accepting the situation. I asked him if there was anyone else living there in the pub, and he said the top floor was occupied by a family, though I never saw them. He had a ring on his finger, and I asked him if he was married or single.
And how did he answer that?
He said he was a widower.
There's always been this public hatred, if you like, of the idea of poison because it's such an insidious way of causing death. Quite what his mindset was, I don't know, but a number of women did come and give evidence.
The press at the time were fascinated by the story of George Chapman. His exceptionally cruel crimes that were seemingly without obvious motive appalled the public. The jury took just 10 minutes to reach their verdict.
Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honour.
Do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty of murder?
Guilty.
Have you anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon you according to law?
Detective Chief Inspector Aberline, who had investigated a lot of the Whitechapel murders, said to his colleague George Godley, who was dealing with the Klosowski case, "I see you've caught Jack the Ripper at last." This actually led to Chapman being regarded as a suspect.
There are coincidences, that's for sure. He lived for a while in Whitechapel. He had some medical training. He abused women. And, rather strangely, he did live for a while with a woman who shared a name with one of the Ripper's victims, Annie Chapman. But that was 5 years after poor, dark Annie was killed in the backyard of a house in Hanbury Street.
No evidence was ever brought forward to show that he was Jack the Ripper. But my own feeling is there's not enough evidence to bring any charges against Chapman.
The once sanguine and confident George Chapman looked numb with terror as the judge donned his black cap with the words, "Severin Klosowski, for I decline to call you by the English name you have assumed. The only satisfactory feature of the case we've just completed is that I'm able to address you as a foreigner and not as an Englishman."
She loved him. He was a monster.
Chapman applied unsuccessfully for a royal pardon and was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on April the 7th, 1903. In his will, Severin Klosowski left items worth, at today's value, £15,000 to the surviving family of Bessie Taylor, but only a ring and some used clothing to the parents of Maud Marsh, whose suspicions eventually led him to justice. Edwardian London saw great changes in the city. The capital was the financial center of the world, and a whole new era was being ushered in. But at the same time, some rather unsavory characters were making their way here.
Fortunately, the Metropolitan Police was changing dramatically and had a whole new set of methods to track them down and, just as vitally, to convict them in court.
You had a system called Bertillonage after Alphonse Bertillon. How this worked was that cards were made out and a criminal was measured. Length of his fingers, size of his head, size of his ears, size of his body. Well, you can imagine putting all these down on cards and then trying to get some form of identification when you've got thousands of cards to compare was almost impossible. So fingerprints are going to change all that in 1905.
The first murder solved in Britain by fingerprints. Murder in Deptford High Street. There was a thumbprint on the cash box, and that led to the conviction of the Stratton brothers. And this led to an almost sort of scientific approach, which started to build Scotland Yard's international reputation.
The new police force and the realm of forensic science would be tested on terrible crimes that were to take place in London. Two of the most notorious were in Camden Town.
Camden at this time is described as being very noisy and dirty. Lots of lorries, horse-drawn vehicles, pubs, and the common people who go to them.
Camden has always been a place that attracted a wide variety of characters. Everyone from the bare-knuckle fighter Tom Sayer to the great novelist Charles Dickens moved to this part of North London.
In the early 20th century, though, the local community in Camden would be shocked to the core by two brutal killings. The first, in 1907, became known as the Camden Town Murder. It was a crime that harked back to the time of Jack the Ripper 20 years earlier, because it involved the murder of a prostitute named Emily Dimmock, who had her throat slashed in her home by a client. Her body was discovered the next day by her partner, and the story grabbed the public's attention. The case aroused the interest of the artist Walter Sickert. He painted a series of works on the Camden Town murder. A man named Robert Wood was apprehended and charged with the crime, based on some writing on a postcard found in the victim's room. But a brilliant defense by the famous barrister Edward Marshall Hall would see him found innocent in court. The case remains unsolved. Just a couple of years later, though, Edward Marshall Hall would again be called to the defense, this time in the case of Dr. Crippen.
Crippen was an American, trained to be a doctor. He came to England, but his medical qualifications weren't recognised. And so he went to work for a patent company dealing with various medicines.
The dividing line between patent medicines and being a quack doctor is a bit blurred. But nevertheless, I'm sure there'd be many people who took what Dr. Crippen gave them and were very grateful. He became friendly with Cora Makamowski. She wanted to be a singer. She used to perform on the music hall stage, which was very popular in those days, and she went by the name of Belle Elmore.
She wanted to sing grand opera, but she didn't have the voice or the talent.
The story of Harvey Hawley Crippen remains one of the most enduring crimes of the 20th century. Some key mysteries surround the case, which have puzzled amateur sleuths for years. This is a sordid and absorbing tale of love lives gone horribly wrong.
It all begins when Dr. Crippen and his wife Cora move into number 39 Hilldrop Crescent in Camden.
Bright and stylish girl you see, belle of good society, not too strict but rather free, yet as right can be, never forward, never bold, not too shy and not too cold, but the very thing I'm told that in your arms you'd like to fold. What do you think, darling?
It's nice.
Oh, you know I hate that word.
So, I had a meeting with Mrs. Curnow today. Well, actually, I decided. Mrs. Curnow was real sorry. I've decided I'm leaving Munyon's. Would you mind? Munyon's just isn't right for me anymore. It's time I focused my energies where it matters, on my other ventures, like we talked about.
The Harvard tooth pullers?
Yale. It's Yale. And you know what? The dentistry is going from strength to strength. In fact, with a little capital investment, a couple of £100. Cora.
Belle, darling.
It's my money, too.
Ta-ra-ra-bum-dee-ay, ta-ra-ra-bum-dee-ay, Ta-ra-ra-bum-dee-hey.
You're my wife.
Ta-ra-ra-bum-dee-hey. Ta-ra-ra-bum-dee-hey. Ta-ra-ra-bum.
Crippen, besides working for a patent medicine company, also worked for a deaf centre. And it's there he met a young typist called Ethel Leneve. The two of them began an affair.
Crippen had been promising her one day it would be better than this. All of a sudden in February, according to her landlady, she cheered up.
Good morning, Dr. Crippen.
I want you to move in with me.
What about your wife? He used to buy me dinner after work. I think at first he was just avoiding going home. He used to say he and Cora, his wife, had drifted apart in sympathy. Then our sneaking off became rather a pleasant routine.
Dr. Crippen was keeping up his routine well. He and his wife Cora entertained their theatrical friends, among whom were the Martinettis, at their home in Hilldrop Crescent.
Mr. Martinetti was a sort of an ageing music hall artist, and Mrs. Martinetti was on a sort of a ladies' club for music hall artists.
Hello, come in. Oh, I do so long for spring. It smells divine in here. Where's Beau?
Let me take your coat.
Oh, don't mind him.
Excuse me. Well, at least if I collapse, I'll know there's a doctor in the house.
Of course I'm married, and we all have our little dramas from time to time. But I thought they got on well.
I'm looking into the wings. I can't even see Lily now.
No.
She's run off.
It's your worst nightmare as a performer.
Just before her entrance, I could not believe it.
Oh, no one in the audience even noticed.
Yes, I'm quite sure you were wonderful.
Oh, thank you, darling.
Isn't he a dear?
So, who's for a game of whist? Oh, certainly, yes.
We stayed in it until around 1:30. But Paul was still under the weather, and darling Belle suggested that we stay the night. That was so like her. But I insisted on getting him home. I didn't want to bother her. I just wish we'd stayed. But I suppose he would have found his cue another night.
Crippen made sure he put on this show of love and affection when the Martinetti couple came over to 39 Hilldrop Crescent for dinner. But it was all a mask. The events that would unfold would see one of the most notorious killers of the 20th century flee across the Atlantic to Canada. With him would be his mistress, Ethel Leneve, who had disguised herself as a boy. The desperate duo would be pursued by one of Scotland Yard's finest, who was determined to bring them in. Camden, January the 31st, 1910. In a townhouse at 39 Hilldrop Crescent, Dr. Crippen and his wife were joined by the Martinettis for dinner, followed by an enjoyable game of whist.
The Martinettis had been musical performers, just like Belle Elmore, and they left at around 1:30 a.m. And the story of Dr. Crippen began.
You've been so sweet.
Nobody knows for sure what happened that night. The supposition is Dr. Crippen murdered Cora Crippen by giving her something to drink.
There are two theories. A shot was heard, and he may have shot her. But in the body was found traces of hyoscine.
Hyoscine was used to calm mental patients in very small amounts. Dr. Crippen had ordered a substantial amount of hyoscine from the local chemist.
The truth is, we simply don't know what happened next. A large dose of hyoscine can have varied effects, especially when mixed with alcohol. Bell likely became frantic, delirious even. Some neighbors reported hearing gunshots and screams coming from the direction of Crippen's house that night, so maybe Crippen panicked and shot her. Those reports were unconfirmed, however, so it's possible that she simply fell unconscious, slipped into a coma, and died. What is certain is that Bell was never seen again after that night. The next morning, Crippen went to work as usual, and when he returned home, the rest of his plan was put into action.
To the Committee of the Music Hall Ladies Guild. Dear friends, forgive me a hasty letter and any inconvenience I may cause you. But I have just had the bad news of the illness of a near relative. And at only a few hours' notice, I am obliged to go to America. Yours faithfully, Belle Elmore.
Dr. Crippen put it out that Cora had been called back to America. Ethel moved in to Dr. Crippen's house.
And soon Ethel Lenabe is seen wearing Mrs. Crippen's furs, she's wearing Mrs. Crippen's jewellery.
Crippen may have thought that all his problems had vanished in an instant. But thankfully, Belle was better liked by her friends than by her husband. Despite Crippen's hopes, Belle's friends had not forgotten her.
It just isn't like Belle. I mean, not even a note.
You're right. The thing is, she's been unwell. Yeah, I just heard from my people this morning. Her lungs, so you see...
Oh, the poor thing. And for a singer too, how terrible.
I don't know that it's as bad as all that. She said it wasn't.
So, you have heard from her?
What?
Belle told you that.
Yeah, but... Well, she's up in the mountains. Out in California, the wild's up there, so, you know...
Well, you send her our best wishes. She'll be back in fine voice soon, I'm certain. Our Belle's a fighter.
Oh yeah, she sure is.
All of a sudden, Dr. Crippen decided that the story he had concocted of his wife's urgent trip to Los Angeles was no longer sufficient on its own. He told her friends that she'd been taken seriously ill herself and was not expected to survive. Then he sent a telegram to Mrs. Martinetti to inform her of Cora's death and cremation.
Suspicions were beginning to grow amongst Belle's friends. One friend who noticed her disappearance was the famous strongwoman Kate Williams, who went by the stage name Vulcana. Not somebody you'd want to be on the wrong side of.
Her act in the music hall was as a strong woman lifting great weights of barbells and that sort of thing. Vulcana came back from America. They had looked to try and catch up with what had happened to Cora and so on, but had drawn a complete blank. So They discussed it amongst their friends and then went to Scotland Yard to express their doubts.
The London community with which Dr. Crippen and his wife had become friendly had been rocked to the very core just over a decade earlier. The well-known actor, William Terrace, was stabbed outside the Adelphi Theatre. His killer was another actor, Richard Archer Prince, who had been his friend. Prince was declared insane and sent to Broadmoor Asylum. His sentence angered the theatrical community. Sir Henry Irving went so far as to say, "Terrace was an actor, so his murderer will not be executed." The William Terrace murder, though, had been a relatively straightforward affair for the London police. The Crippen mystery would be far more challenging.
But fortunately, a man called Walter Dew was on the case. He was no stranger to shocking murder, having been one of the team that tried to capture Jack the Ripper 20 years earlier.
Dew was only a young policeman at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders. He joined 1882, about 6 years before the murders. And he said that it talked about the tension in the area, and you'd only got to say Jack the Ripper, and you could get an explosive incident. And when some lunatic runs down the street shouting, "I am Jack the Ripper, I am Jack the Ripper," immediately a lynch mob is formed. Dew and other policemen grab hold of this lunatic, have barricade themselves in a house, waiting for reinforcements, while outside a lynch mob is howling to get hold of this person and string them up on the nearest lamppost.
In the case of Dr. Crippen, Walter Dew's first move was to head over to Hilldrop Crescent to get some answers to Cora's disappearance.
He's at work?
And you are his...
Housekeeper. If you come back later, he'll be here. You talk to him then. You should come back.
We would very much like to speak with him now, Miss Leneve.
He's at work? I could telephone.
Where is it your employer works?
The police would have their work cut out to bring him to justice. The case would be a sensation for press and public.
Crippen had dispatched his wife, set up an elaborate story to promote his innocence, and moved his mistress, Ethel Leneve, into the marital home. But Inspector Dew had grown very suspicious. He made Ethel take him to see Dr. Crippen before she had a chance to telephone ahead and warn of the inspector's impending arrival.
This time, though, he was to get his man.
Dr. Crippen had murdered his wife, Cora, and moved his mistress, Ethel, into their house at 39 Hilldrop Crescent, Camden. He had concocted an elaborate story, which began to slowly unravel once Inspector Dew started digging.
And she died in Los Angeles, is that correct?
Must be 3 months back now. Gosh, yeah, March 23rd.
And you're certain of that, Dr. Crippen?
I think I would remember a thing like that, don't you?
It's just the authorities there have no record of your wife's death.
Well, that is strange. I can't... Gosh, I suppose I had better tell the truth. My wife, my wife isn't dead. She left me. I feel a real fool, let me tell you. You think advertising in the States might help? You know, a reward for information, that sort of thing?
It might.
I'm just keen to help, however I can, officer.
Inspector. You don't jump to the conclusion murder has been committed merely because a wife has disappeared and her husband has told lies about it. But he had lied.
Crippen was clearly spooked and decided that the best course of action would be to leave the country with Ethel immediately.
Certain people with no knowledge of police procedure and even less of the law blamed me for letting Crippen go. I ought to have arrested him, they said. But there had been no shred of evidence against him. It's futile to talk of arresting a man until you know there has been a crime.
Walter Dew made further inquiries over the weekend and called again at Hilltop Crescent on the Monday morning to find both Crippen and Ethel and Eve were no longer there.
The neighbours haven't seen them, sir, but we spoke to one of his colleagues. He says the doctor was at his office Saturday morning. Crippen gave him £2, told him to go and buy a boy's suit, tie and braces, a brown bowler hat and size 5 boots.
What size shoe do you suppose Miss Leneve takes? I want descriptions of both of them circulated to all ports, domestic and foreign.
Yes, sir.
My quarry had gone, and the manner of his going pointed to guilt. Here was the real clue. His decision was a sudden one. Of that I felt convinced. He was scared.
As instructions were sent out to track down Dr. Crippen and his mistress Ethel Leneve, who had both suddenly disappeared, Inspector Walter Dew made further searches at the Crippen household. The first searches of the house showed no sign of Cora, and no evidence of a struggle or any kind of disturbance. The police were persistent, certain that Crippen wouldn't have fled so quickly for no reason. Eventually, their persistence paid off.
The police made a grim discovery in the cellar. Human remains covered in quicklime. The bones, head, limbs, and sex organs had been cut away.
The skull, arms, various bones are missing, and there's just this mangled pieces of flesh.
They called in the expert pathologists from Imperial College. They made tests on the flesh and found that it contained traces of hyoscine.
Large amounts of hyoscine were extracted. Its identity was confirmed by being tested on a cat. Apparently, a cat's eyes dilate in the presence of hyoscine. Belle Elmore could be identified only by a small piece of flesh from her abdomen. It bore a scar consistent with an ovurectomy that she had undergone.
The pathologist was a young man called Bernard Spilsbury. He contradicted the other specialists who'd been called in, and he'd found this scar tissue. The significance is that Mrs. Martinetti had seen a scar on Cora Crippen's abdomen. Apparently she'd had an operation. This becomes very relevant to the case.
Some of the parts of the flesh were wrapped up in what turned out to be, was identified as Crippen's pyjamas. And it then turned into a murder hunt.
A warrant was put out for Dr. Crippen and Ethel Leneve. False sightings were reported all over the country, but nobody knew for sure where they were.
This case caused enormous interest in the newspapers. It was an American doctor having an affair with his typist. It involved the music hall and a singer. So there was this great publicity, and lots of people came up with various leads on where Dr. Crippen might have gone to, including places on the continent.
The most promising lead came from a quite unexpected source. A ship on the Atlantic, the SS Montrose, that was headed to Canada. Its captain, Henry Kendall, had only 20 passengers traveling in second class on his ship, and he had become extremely suspicious of 2 of them.
It wasn't a very good way for them to have been anonymous.
They're using aliases. Ethel Leneve had a haircut she disguised as Crippen's son.
The boat was equipped with the new Marconi wireless telegraph. So Kendall actually used this telegram to relay his suspicions to Scotland Yard.
Henry Kendall, captain of the SS Montrose, sent the following message to his head office in Liverpool. Montrose, 130 miles west of Lizard. Have strong suspicion that Crippen, London cellar murderer, and accomplice are amongst saloon passengers. Moustache shaved off, growing beard, accomplice dressed as a boy, voice, manner, and build, undoubtedly a girl. Kendall.
Walter Dew had a tough decision to make. Whether to trust these unconfirmed reports by telegraph from a ship in the middle of the Atlantic. He decided he had to act and boarded another ship, the much faster Laurentic, that was due to arrive in Canada before the Montrose.
What made it a sensational case was that Dew used the wireless telegraph to send reports back to England. These were going in the newspapers, and Crippen, of course, with Ethel Leneve, were completely unaware of this going on, so the press were having a wonderful time with all this information.
Dew's ship raced across the Atlantic, landing in Canada 2 days before the Montrose was due to arrive. The murder of Cora Crippen and the flight of her husband were now a worldwide sensation. The press on both sides of the Atlantic were desperate for any detail about the case. Murder, adultery, theatre, technology. It was the perfect story. A large crowd gathered in Quebec to greet the arriving SS Montrose. Dew put on the uniform of a pilot officer and was rowed out to the ship accompanied by 2 officers of the Quebec City Police. Forewarned of his arrival, the ship's captain greeted him on the bridge and accompanied him to a private cabin. There, Dew waited, until the Canadian policeman could bring him the man suspected of being the missing murderer. Duke could only wait.
Walter Dew, dressed up as a ship's captain, boarded the Montrose, spoke to the captain, and of course there wasn't really any doubt that it was Crippen and Ethel. They were then returned on the Laurentic's sister ship, the Magentic, back to Liverpool. Ethel Leneve was really pleased to be able to get out of boys' clothes, and she said Walter Dew was very kind because he allowed her to send out for some proper woman's clothes, and at Walter Dew's suggestion she got this hat with a veil so that her face would be protected from the press cameras.
On their return to London, Dr. Crippen and Ethel Leneve would face the full force of British justice. They would also find a public thirsting for every detail of this sensational murder, and a song written in their dubious honour. Dr. Crippen killed Belle Elmore, ran away with Miss Leneve, right across the ocean blue, followed by Inspector Dew. Ships ahoy, naughty boy!
Dr. Crippen and Ethel Leneve were now back in London.
They had attempted to flee to Canada on the ship SS Montrose, with Ethel assuming, rather oddly, the identity of a young boy. They had almost got away with it, but were thwarted by Inspector Walter Dew, who was awaiting their arrival in Canada with handcuffs at the ready in order to bring them back to London.
At the Old Bailey on October the 18th, 1910.
Hawley, Crippen, you are indicted and also charged on the coroner's inquisition with the wilful murder of Cora Crippen on the 1st of February last. Are you guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty, my lord.
Dr. Crippen was in many ways a modest man. In others, he was egotistical. I shall always believe he was vain enough to think he had committed the perfect crime.
Expert opinion was provided by both the defense and the prosecution, and it often conflicted. One side would say that the carving up of the body found under the cellar required great expertise and practice, while the other side would say, well, anybody could do that with a bit of medical training. There were also conflicting arguments about the piece of flesh. Did it actually have the scar that Belle Elmore was known to have from an operation?
It was like a Y-shaped scar, some of which could be a crease, other parts of which was surgical.
It was folded over, and there was argument whether the scar was in fact a fold of flesh or whether it was a scar. Spilsbury convinced the jury that it was a scar.
That scar was consistent with an operation. Her sister travelled over from America and gave evidence at the Old Bailey to this effect.
The interesting thing is, in recent years, a sort of DNA has been done on the remains. Cora's DNA doesn't match up any of the surviving family.
DNA evidence suggested that the flesh was male.
All of which adds to the controversy.
At the time of the Crippen trial, though, the evidence presented to the court was groundbreaking, and people were going to be naturally hesitant about accepting it. But in Bernard Spilsbury, the prosecution had an expert who was going to change the face of forensic science.
Bernard Spilsbury gave evidence about the hyacinth, and actually it was the first famous case in which Bernard Spilsbury had given this expert evidence as a pathologist. He became very eminent in the next 30 years and became very famous indeed.
Crippen had a formidable court opponent in Bernard Spilsbury, but he did have Edward Marshall Hall, known as the Great Defender, on his team. Hall had successfully defended Robert Wood 3 years earlier in the case of the Camden Town murder. After some discussion, however, as the trial approached, Hall decided not to lead Crippen's defense. Crippen was in real trouble. The prosecution was led by Richard Muir, who secured conviction in the Stratton brothers case, the first men to be convicted of murder on fingerprint evidence. When Muir was appointed prosecutor, Crippen is reported to have said, "I wish it had been anyone else. I fear the worst."
Crippen was damned by the actions he took both before and after Bell's disappearance.
On the early morning of the 1st of February, you were left alone in your house with your wife. Is that correct?
Yes.
She was alive?
Yes.
And well?
She was.
Do you know of anybody in the world who has seen your wife alive since?
I do not.
Do you know of anybody who has received a letter from her since?
I do not.
Do you know of anyone who could swear they ever saw your wife leave that house alive?
I told Mr. Dew all the facts.
But you have made no inquiries.
I have made no inquiries.
It would be most important for your defense if someone could be found who saw your wife after the Martinettis did. You do realize that?
I do.
And you have made no inquiries.
I have made no inquiries.
In my whole dealings with him, I saw nothing which, by the wildest stretch of the imagination, could suggest a capacity for so terrible a crime. But I never entertained a doubt about his guilt.
The jury took just 27 minutes to reach their verdict. Guilty. Ethel Leneve was tried separately as an accessory after the fact, but in truth, the prosecutor's heart was not in it. The case was a slender one, and she was acquitted.
I think Ethel may have known what had happened. I don't think she could have been that completely innocent. That she foolishly walked around wearing Mrs. Crippen's jewellery and Mrs. Crippen's furs. She must have had knowledge of the murder. I can't believe that she took these things and didn't ask how or why they'd been left behind.
It was an accident, killing Cora. It must have been. I would still marry him.
They have their rules. I won't be getting you in trouble again.
You look well.
Yeah, they're taking care of me. Darling, you have been my one comfort all these years. My one comfort. God bless you, my darling.
Crippen appealed against his death sentence to the then Home Secretary, Winston Churchill. Churchill went over the case in detail, but decided against commuting the sentence to life imprisonment. He did, however, allow this final personal meeting between Crippen and Ethel at Pentonville Prison before the execution. Crippen was hanged on the 23rd of November, 1910. He may be long dead, but fascination for the man lives on. His story has been retold many times in varying literary and film adaptations. The case was a sensation in its day, but unanswered questions remain. What really happened in that house that night? How much did Ethel really know?
Occasional attempts are made to prove Crippen's innocence, but there can be little doubt of the guilt of the killer of Camden Town.
Margaret Lofty had died in the bathtub the day after marrying the mysterious John Lloyd. At first, it seemed her death had been a tragic accident. But Scotland Yard was about to receive a message from a concerned landlord that was to cast suspicion on Margaret's husband.
Fortunately, Inspector Arthur Neal was on the case. He would eventually become one of the so-called Big Four, the four superintendents in charge of the Criminal Investigations Department at Scotland Yard.
Little did the police know just how bizarre and terrifying a life George Joseph Smith was leading. The investigation would demand all the efforts of one of the greatest forensic scientists of the era, and legion of a public looking for anything to distract them from the worries of World War I.